The heart monitor's steady beep was the only sound that kept Margaret Rhodes tethered to hope on the night everything changed. She stood over her seventh patient of a double shift, her scrubs stained with someone else's suffering, her feet screaming in protest against the worn-out sneakers she'd had for 3 years. It was 2 a.m. at County General Hospital, and Margaret was running on her third cup of coffee, and the kind of determination that only comes when you have no other choice. Her daughter was waiting at home, asleep in their shared studio apartment that cost more than Margaret made in a week. Her mother was downstairs, deteriorating in a care facility that drained every penny Margaret could find. There was no safety net. There was only this, the endless cycle of sacrifice that had become her life. She had chosen nursing because she believed in something bigger than herself. That idealism had been real once, vivid and burning. But 15 years later, that flame had dimmed into something more like survival. Margaret had watched colleagues leave for better-paying jobs, better hours, better lives. She had stayed because people needed her, because walking away felt like abandonment, because she didn't know how to do anything else. The debt from her education had only recently stopped feeling like a physical weight on her chest. Now it was just a constant ache, like an old injury that never quite healed. The patient in room 412 was an elderly man named Robert. He had come in alone, no family, no visitors, suffering from pneumonia that had worsened into something more serious. His insurance was minimal, his resources non-existent. Margaret had learned not to ask questions about people's circumstances. It only made the heartbreak worse, but something about Robert had gotten under her skin. Maybe it was because he reminded her of her own father, gone for a decade now. Maybe it was because he had whispered, "Thank you," every time she checked on him, even when she was simply doing her job. Maybe it was because he was alone in a way that most people never experience. That night, as Margaret moved through the hospital with mechanical efficiency, Robert had coded. His monitors had erupted into that terrible symphony of alarm that every nurse dreads. She had run to his room, had helped perform CPR, had watched as they fought against the darkness creeping into his body. And then, just as suddenly, they had brought him back. His eyes had opened, confused and afraid, and Margaret had been the first face he saw. She had held his hand and whispered reassurances, even though she was terrified of losing him again. "You're not alone," she had promised him, and she meant it with every fiber of her being, even though it was probably just words to him, even though she couldn't afford to care this deeply about every patient who came through that door. What Margaret didn't know was that someone had been watching. In the corner of the hospital room, barely noticeable among the monitors and medical equipment, a wealthy businessman sat in a wheelchair. His name was James Whitmore, and he had been admitted through the VIP wing after a heart attack 3 days earlier. He was supposedly resting, recovering in his private room 2 floors up, but he had insisted on visiting the general ward. His doctors thought he was crazy. His business associates thought he was wasting time. But James had made a practice of understanding the places where real life happened, the places beyond the polished surfaces of his empire. He had wheeled himself to that hallway at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps the right one. He had seen Margaret stumble as she rushed toward room 412, had watched her steady herself against the wall, had observed the determination in her face as she moved forward anyway. And then, through the open door, he had witnessed something that stopped him cold. He had seen her perform CPR on Robert, with a precision that spoke of countless hours of practice. He had seen her touch that old man's shoulder with genuine tenderness. He had heard her voice break slightly as she promised him that he wasn't alone. James Whitmore had made his billions in technology, in calculated risks and ruthless efficiency. He had spent his life building a legacy of wealth, convinced that money was the measure of all things worth measuring. But as he sat in that wheelchair, watching a tired woman in scrubs pour out her humanity for someone she would probably never see again, after his recovery, something shifted in his chest. It wasn't the remaining after-effect of his cardiac event. It was something deeper. It was a question that had been nagging at him for years, finally demanding an answer. What was all of it for? He made a quiet decision that night. What followed was a series of events that Margaret was too exhausted to question at first. Robert's insurance situation somehow resolved itself. The paperwork that usually took weeks to navigate appeared handled. His room was upgraded. But Margaret was used to small miracles in hospitals. She had learned to accept them and move forward without dissecting the logistics. Then came the day a lawyer arrived at the hospital with her name. Margaret thought someone had sued her. Her stomach had dropped, her mind racing through every possible mistake, every protocol that might have been questioned. Instead, the lawyer handed her a letter. It was from James Whitmore. He explained with clarity and directness what he had witnessed that night. He acknowledged her sacrifice, and then he told her what he had done. He had endowed a scholarship program in her name. He had paid off her educational debt in its entirety. He had purchased a house in the neighborhood where she had always wanted to live, setting up a trust fund so that her mother's care facility would be covered for the rest of her life. He had ensured that her daughter's college education would be completely funded, with enough left over for graduate school if she chose it. But the letter continued with something even more extraordinary. He wanted to sponsor a new ward in the hospital, dedicated to providing care to underinsured patients, and he wanted her to lead it. "I've spent my life building things for the wrong reasons," the letter read. "But I've never forgotten that night I watched you promise a stranger that he wasn't alone. That's the most valuable thing I've ever seen built. I hope you'll help me build more of it." Margaret had sunk into a chair in the hospital cafeteria and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. She cried for the sacrifices, for the nights she had wondered how she would make it to the next day, for the weight of carrying so much alone. But she also cried because someone had been watching, and more importantly, someone had understood. Someone with the power to change things had recognized that real power isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in moments of genuine connection, in the willingness to see another person suffering and respond with compassion rather than indifference. Within a year, the James Whitmore Ward for vulnerable patients became a reality. Margaret's life transformed in ways she had never imagined possible. But more than that, she had become a catalyst for change. With the resources she finally possessed, she began working with other hospitals, other underfunded systems, creating paths for struggling healthcare workers to thrive rather than merely survive. She brought Robert, who had recovered fully, onto the board of her new initiative. They became unlikely partners in the work of extending grace to the people society often forgets. One day, sitting in the office that had once been unimaginable to her, Margaret asked James the question that had been in her mind since that first letter. "Why did you care enough to do all of this? You could have forgotten what you saw." James smiled, and she could see in his face the remnants of the man he had been before compassion had reorganized his priorities. "Because I was about to die," he said simply. "And in that moment I realized I had built an empire with my life, but you had built a legacy with yours. You had built it one patient, one promise, one act of kindness at a time. I want to spend whatever time I have left helping you build it bigger." The moral of this story isn't that kindness always brings reward, or that selflessness is rewarded by billionaires. The moral is that kindness matters, not because of what it might return, but because of who it makes us. Margaret had already been changed by her commitment to care, already transformed by her choices, before James Whitmore ever entered her life. What his intervention did was prove something she had begun to doubt, that her sacrifice had meaning, that her exhaustion had purpose, and that in a world that often feels coldly transactional, human connection remains the most valuable currency of all. Her daughter grew up watching a mother who had changed the world simply by refusing to abandon hope. Her mother spent her final years in comfort, surrounded by the care she deserved. And countless others, patients, nurses, healthcare workers, found themselves held by a safety net woven from one woman's extraordinary humanity. Margaret continued working at the hospital, even after she no longer needed to, because she had learned that work done with love is never really work at all. It's the thing that makes us most human, most real, most ourselves. That night in room 412, when she had promised a stranger that he wasn't alone, she had no idea that someone was watching. But more importantly, she had no idea that she was exactly where she needed to be, becoming exactly who she needed to become.